Welcome to The Debate. Uruguay, it's often celebrated as this digital leader in Latin America, but recent events have really painfully exposed what some are calling a profound national cyber debt. And this tension, it was, well, brutally illuminated by that catastrophic breach of 30,000 national digital identity certificates. So our central question today is really about how we assess national risk. Does the highly technical and, let's be honest, often painful critique from experts like Alberto Daniel Hill, who speaks from, intense personal consequence and professional trauma, does that offer more valuable, more predictive insight into systemic cyber risk than, say, the official top-down approach that's championed by government bodies and these modernized legal frameworks?
I'm going to argue that Hill's kind of radical transparency and his technical warnings are the crucial, necessary truth that, well, institutional narratives tend to ignore, often to the nation's detriment.
Right. And I'm approaching this from, well, a slightly different angle. Look, we absolutely cannot deny the severe deficiencies that Hill's story exposed in the past. And his trauma is genuinely a tragedy of that oldest system. But I think long-term national stability and, measurable progress, they fundamentally rely on formal, scalable structures. So I'll maintain that institutions like AGISIC, the nation's lead digital government agency, and the, frankly, overdue enactment of the 2024 cybercrime law, these are really the only reliable mechanisms for securing Uruguay's digital future. They offer solutions that go beyond individual advocacy or exposure.
Predictive value of expertise that's rooted in hard reality. Hill's analysis, which came from his own experience working inside state systems up until 2016, was, well, crystal clear. The systems were just riddled with poor security controls, and critical human resources were simply not adequately trained. This wasn't some abstract theory. This was firsthand technical reality he was describing. And the first big validation of this, it came in February 2021, right after those really embarrassing hacks of the DNIC, the National Civil Identification Directorate, and the Ministry of Defense. Hill gave an interview on Radio Serendi, and he stated, quite explicitly, that the breach was not an isolated incident. He even said that stolen Ministry of Defense data was already being sold to the highest bidder on the dark web for $500,000. This critique, it immediately exposed the official denial, right? Because the Ministry of Defense was trying to downplay the severity, saying the info wasn't sensitive, even though the documents themselves, the ones being sold, were visibly marked confidential. That kind of clarity, earned after, being unjustly jailed for 8 months, it forces necessary, maybe uncomfortable truths onto the public record, bypassing that institutional urge to just save face.
I absolutely recognize the power of that story and the insight that comes from his experience. But I would frame the necessary response quite differently. Hill's initial ordeal, being charged with attempted extortion because the penal code just didn't have a way to define hacking, that perfectly illustrates why the main institutional priority really had to be the legal framework. His trauma was, in large part, defined by a law that was, well, stuck in the 1900s. And the government has since addressed this urgency. The cybercrime law number 23227, enacted in 2024, it directly tackles those historic gaps. Things like unauthorized data access, identity theft, computer fraud. They're now clearly sanctioned. You see, long-term national security, it just can't be built on individual, unvetted critique, however valid it might seem at times. It really has to hinge on these formal entities, like AGISIC and the Specialized Police Unit, being empowered with clear, modern legal tools that align Uruguay with international standards, particularly the Budapest Convention.
Okay, but relying on a functional judiciary is exactly where the problem lies, isn't it? Because if the laws are new but the enforcement is, frankly, incompetent, the threat doesn't actually go away. But let's focus on the ultimate validation of Hill's 2021 warning, the public key infrastructure crisis. I mean, his statement back then about systemic weakness and exposure, it was ultimately validated by that catastrophic breach where this threat actor, Urigagu 1337, managed to steal and then crack the passwords for 30,000 national digital identity certificates. This wasn't just, typical data theft. PKI, public key infrastructure, it's the absolute bedrock of digital life in Uruguay. It's what authenticates your legal identity for pretty much everything, e-commerce, government services, you name it. So the theft of 30,000 of these certificates, that was like the theft of legal personhood itself on a massive scale.
That crisis confirmed the soaring cost of institutional denial, driving cyber incidents from, under 5,000 in 2023 to over 14,000 in 2024. That's an attack every 30 minutes. Ignoring the expert truth, the warning that was right there, it led directly to catastrophe.
I'm not entirely convinced that the validation of a warning, however accurate, is inherently more valuable than the systemic response it eventually triggered. The PKI breach, yes, catastrophic, I agree. But it also acted as a harsh catalyst, a real accelerator for institutional change. What matters now, I think, is that the government is showing the capacity to learn and adapt by putting specific, punitive legal measures in place. The new cybercrime law specifically sanctions the exact crimes committed by actors like Urigagu 1337, namely identity theft and unauthorized access. Before 2024, police and prosecutors, they were basically forced to kind of shoehorn really sophisticated digital crimes, like stealing these digital certificates, into old, outdated categories like attempted extortion or even property destruction, which, of course, made successful prosecution almost impossible because the legal definition just didn't fit the digital reality. These new, precise legal tools, they are absolutely indispensable for the specialized cybercrime units to operate effectively going forward.
Legal tools, however precise they are on paper, are completely useless if the people actually wielding them are technically incompetent. And that incompetence, it was matched only by the systemic negligence in the justice system itself. Hill's own case, the so-called Operation Bitcoins, provides specific, documented evidence of just how deep this systemic technical failure ran, which really undermines any claim about current legal efficacy. I mean, the primary evidence used to justify his incarceration, legally useless printed firewall logs. Printed! Furthermore, the alleged extortion email itself had this massive glaring flaw. It had no Bitcoin payment address, which makes the whole charge nonsensical on its face. And the sheer forensic negligence that was documented, it's staggering. His confiscated cell phone was kept powered on and connected to a network for a full week, totally contaminating any potential evidence.
Hard drives were literally found, quote, thrown on the floor. I just don't see how a new piece of legislation magically fixes investigative incompetence that severe, unless there's immediate, mandatory, rigorous technical training enforced across the board.
That specific account of forensic failure, yeah. The hard drives on the floor, the contaminated phone, it is genuinely staggering. And I won't deny that it highlights an appalling level of technical and procedural deficiency in the old system. Absolutely. But we have to see that failure as a symptom of the pre-2024 environment, right? An environment where digital crimes just weren't legally prioritized or even properly understood. The core insight here, I think, is that the system eventually recognized its own ignorance. That highly publicized anecdote, about the very Interpol agent who coerced Hill's confession, later reaching out to him to ask him to teach Interpol about crypto and fraud, that perfectly illustrates the skills gap that the formal system is now mandated to fill. AG Essek and Kalen, the National Higher Education Center, they are actively training technical experts in law enforcement now, implementing structured top-down education. Systemic competence has to be built through these formal mandates, not just, spontaneous learning. It's really the only scalable path forward.
But that institutional commitment, however well-intentioned, it feels fundamentally undermined by the lack of safety provided by the official channels themselves. Hill's very public decision never to report a security flaw again because of his trauma and the complete lack of legal protection created a demonstrable chilling effect. It's well known that many ethical professionals in Uruguay just stopped reporting security incidents to CERT-U,
the National Emergency Response Team. Why? Out of fear that they'd be prosecuted rather than thanked. Since CERT-U itself can't offer legal guarantees or immunity to reporters, good intentions are still just a personal gamble. And that fundamentally undermines the national ability to gather threat intelligence, regardless of how modern your shiny new law is. If the ethical experts, the ones who find the flaws, are terrified to speak up, then all those technical flaws just remain open, waiting for the real threat actors to exploit them.
Okay, the chilling effect is definitely a serious constraint on threat intelligence gathering. I absolutely agree. It's a real problem. But the appropriate solution has to be formal, protective legislation laws that explicitly guarantee immunity and non-retaliation for responsible disclosure, not this sort of radical transparency operating completely outside formal checks and balances. Look, AGSIC and the URCP, the Data Protection Unit, they do have mandatory reporting requirements now for critical entities. That demonstrates the institutional commitment to gathering threat intelligence through official structured channels. And furthermore, the prominence of Hill and others using this radical transparency on platforms like, say, Twitter Spaces. While it's effective for raising public awareness, sure, it also creates an unfiltered intelligence network, and that information completely bypasses the necessary scrutiny and structure of official intelligence channels, which, in the context of national security and critical infrastructure, carries its own significant risks. Stability really demands verified, structured intelligence flow, not just raw data dumps.
I see why you prioritize the structure I do. But Hill's experience, it just remains this stark mirror for the nation, doesn't it? It shows that when the official channels fail, by unjustly punishing ethical disclosure, by relying on frankly useless evidence, and by downplaying severe public threats like that 2021 DNIC hack, sometimes the only recourse left is the raw, expert technical truth, delivered with that radical transparency. The 2024 PKI crisis was just the ultimate high-stakes proof of the cost of ignoring that truth for 3 long years.
And I wholeheartedly agree that the immense personal cost to Hill exposed severe, frankly inexcusable systemic failures, particularly within the judicial and legal infrastructure of that specific time, no question. However, the maturation of a digital nation, it has to proceed through the formal evolution of its legal and governmental structures. The 2024 cybercrime law and these specialized units, they are the foundational steps towards institutional accountability. And they're really the only way to build systemic competence that can actually survive leadership changes and political shifts. Stability requires institutional order to effectively contain and prosecute modern threats, even if, yes, individual acts of defiance initially helped illuminate the path forward.
And I suppose this debate really highlights that ongoing, almost universal conflict you see in every digital nation, right? That tension between those who prioritize the raw, necessary technical truth, maybe to prevent immediate catastrophe, and those who prioritize legal, structured, institutional order to try and achieve long-term scalable stability. Especially when faced with these rapidly escalating digital threats. The material we've looked at makes it pretty clear that both perspectives have a profound and very active impact on Uruguay's security landscape moving forward.
And with this cybercrime law now actually in force, the real question is how those institutions will utilize and, crucially, protect technical expertise, whether that expertise comes from formally trained government professionals or from critical, sometimes challenging voices like Hill's. That interaction, I think, will ultimately determine the true resilience of the country's digital future.